So the month of May is typically known as Blockbuster Month, and this is where the studios kind of start putting out some of their big hits, especially leading up to Memorial Day weekend. Well, May of 1996 was kind of a dud of a month. We did get some hits, but we got a lot of misses. So I guess we should take a look at several movies that are turning 30 this May. So I'm gonna first just start off with Dragonheart. This is a movie about a knight who is like a dragon hunter who's out there to try to kill the very last dragon. And you know what? This is not a bad movie. It's a very touching movie. It stars as Quaid as your main hero, and then you have Sir Sean Connery as Draco the Dragon. Man, and the special effects for this time were actually really amazing. I do remember watching like a lot of the behind the scenes when they were making this movie and how they did the special effects, how they kind of did like photos and reference photos of Sean Connery's face to make it look like the actual dragon speaking. Oh man, this is a great movie. And the soundtrack for this movie has been used tons of times over. You may hear it in movie trailers, you may hear it at the Oscars. Yeah, this soundtrack is just great too. But kind of give you a little summary of what the story is about. Basically, we have this king, this evil king, who is kind of immortal. We have our hero, the knight, played by Dennis Quaid, who believes that this dragon was the reason why the king is evil. Because there's a story of the dragon giving half of his heart to the king, and then the king having immortality and everything like that. But turns out the king was always evil. He was always an evil man. And then it becomes basically this knight and Draco the dragon having to go fight off and defeat this king. Because as the legend holds, that once one of them dies, the other will too, because they're sharing half a heart. It's really crazy too. It's kind of a simple plot, but it's a very entertaining movie. And if you've never seen Dragonheart, I do recommend you check this one out. Next up, we have a comedy that I truly adore, and that is Spyhard. Yes, the Leslie Nielsen spy spoof movie that came out way before, actually just 1 year, before Austin Powers came out in 1996. So, what is Spyhard? So, what Spyhard is a story of a secret agent named Dick Steele, or Agent WD-40, who, after his lover is killed by the General Rancor, who is played by Andy Griffith, which is really funny to see Andy Griffith playing this bad guy. I think it's kind of funny. You don't picture him. He's Andy Griffith. He is the sheriff of the little town, He's Matlock. So Agent Steele ends up retiring. So we find out that Rancor actually survived the whole incident in the beginning of the movie. He actually kidnaps Barbara Dahl, who is the daughter of Victoria Dahl, his love interest. And if you didn't catch those names, I just said right now, as I'm saying them out loud. I don't know why. That has actually went over my head all these years. Victoria Dahl, Barbara Dahl. Yeah. Anyways, so we have that going on. We have Rancor who's kidnapped the scientist, and now we have a new, the daughter of the scientist, Agent 3.14, Agent Pi, who is now helping Agent Steele actually find her father and rescue him. I don't know. This movie is just crazy. It's goofy. It's over the top. It's just one of those late spoof movies that just right as when the spoof movies were trying to take turn for the worse. They would come back during the scary movie era, but this is kind of like the end of that weird goofy comedy. I mean, there's like a Jurassic Park reference in this movie too, which is weird to say. Weird Al does the theme song for this movie, and that's super catchy theme song. It does suck that Austin Powers came out a year later because it kind of took away from this movie, and this movie ended up just kind of disappearing altogether. I don't know. If you're a fan of Leslie Nielsen, if you like spoof comedies, if you like a fun time while watching and laughing at a movie, I would recommend you check out Spy Hard because it's actually one of my favorite comedies. All right, next up on the list we have Barbwire. Yep, yep, that movie starring Pamela Anderson came out 30 years ago. So, Barbwire is based off the comic book of the same name, which actually surprisingly ended before this movie came out. Yeah, kind of weird to think about. So in this movie, it's the year 2017. America is in the middle of a second civil war. So the movie takes place in the last free city in California, Steel Harbor. And here we meet Pamela Anderson, who plays Barbwire, who runs a nightclub. Yes, an adult nightclub. And is also like a bounty hunter at night. So we have that going on. So what ends up happening is that we find out there's a scientist who has developed a virus that could change the tide of the war, basically. So Barbwire ends up in the possession of the scientist to help the scientist out, who is also dating her ex too. So basically, Barbwire, her ex-boyfriend, Axel Hood, played by Tamura Morrison, the guy who played Boba Fett, Jango Fett, who played all the clones in the early Star Wars prequels. Yeah, that guy. Yes, he plays the boyfriend in this movie. And basically, the plot of the movie is that they have to get Dr. Devonshire all the way from the city, all the way to Canada, where they have allies out there to help her with their project, her experiments, stuff like that. So, yeah, that's pretty much the plot of this movie. Very simple plot, very action packed, a lot of skin in this movie. I'd say that. This is a very spicy movie in many ways. So yeah, so what this movie is pretty much a staple in the 90s in a weird way because the director was told that he had to make this movie a little more adult oriented because as they had Pamela Anderson in the film. And that is a crazy thing for this movie. But yeah, the director, David Hogan, actually, this is his first movie he ever directed. He did a second unit on some other big movies, but his first solo movie, he did direct one more movie, but since then, he's pretty much stuck to directing music videos for many years. Um, and when this movie did come out, the studio had two movies they were trying to market. They had this movie and Mystery Science Theater 3000, the movie. And they felt like since this had a bigger star power to it with Pamela Anderson, they actually put all their money and their marketing towards this movie. And that seemed to have been a really big miss for them. Because if you compare those two movies that came out around the same time, Mystery Science Theater 3000 is a better movie. In my opinion, that's how I feel. So, yeah. So, yeah, that's Barbwire that came out in 1996. Next up, we have the cult classic The Craft that came out in 1996. So, what's crazy about this is that in 1996, we both had The Craft and Scream that both starred Nev Campbell and Skeet Ulrich. Can you believe that? So, there's a story behind the scenes of this movie that Nev Campbell and Skeet Ulrich actually made a bet on the set to say which movie would actually be the higher performing movie, The Craft or Scream. Of course, Scream was a runaway hit, and Skeet Ulrich actually lost the bet and had to dress as a chicken out in New York City. That's just crazy to think about. But yeah, so what is The Craft? So the story follows Sarah, played by Robin Tooney, who ends up moving to another town with her father and her stepmom because of an incident that happened in her previous town. Well, in this town, she's not considered the popular. She's trying to figure her way out. And she ends up becoming friends with a group of outcast girls who turn out to be witches. And these were Bonnie, played by Nev Campbell, who is insecure because her body has like all these burn scars on her body. Next, we have Nancy, who has a horrible home life, played by Fruza Balk, and she was a staple in the 90s. She was everywhere in the 90s, I feel like. And Rochelle, who is being racially profiled and people are being racist to her, basically, who's being played by Rachel True. And basically, what happened, these four girls basically create their own coven. They figure out they all have powers and they're actually very powerful witches. And they basically make some wishes that, like the old adage says, be careful what you wish for. And just like the old adage also says, that absolute power does corrupt. Because eventually Sarah ends up having to go at odds against Nancy, who becomes a very powerful evil witch by the end of this movie. But yeah, this movie has a huge cult following, and my wife loves this movie. This is one of her all-time favorite movies, along with The Crow. This is one of those kind of movies that has come like this movie, this rite of passage for young women, for trying to find themselves, or stuff like that. So yeah, The Cult is a pretty decent movie in my opinion. I've seen it a couple of times. It's actually not that bad. They did make a sequel 20 years later, Craft Legacy. Not a great movie. Loosely tied to this movie in a very small way. Um, And the crazy thing about this too is they did try making a TV show of the craft, but they couldn't get the studios behind it. And a couple of years later, we get Charmed, which is kind of a similar idea. They even used the same song. I believe it was called "How Soon Is Now," which is the theme song for Charmed, was actually used in this movie too. And it's the same song, the same cover version of the song played by Love Spit Love. So that's fascinating to know about too. I do kind of remember in the 90s thinking, Charmed kind of remind me a lot of The Craft. Now I know there was some similarities between them. Anyways, so that is The Craft, which turns 30 this year. That's bonkers. And another movie that had a sequel that came out almost 30 years later also is turning 30 this month, and that is Twister. This is probably one of my favorite movies from this year. Twister, starring Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton. This is just a fun action movie. It's like those end of the world movies that we used to see in the 90s. Yeah, it's one of those movies where we have Bill Paxton's character who is in the middle of a divorce, about to get remarried, and he comes back into town to have his ex-wife sign the papers. Joe, played by Helen Hunt. And of course, they're in a town where there's tornadoes. And we find out that a device that the two of them created, Joe has finally got the funding for it and is about to launch it into the next tornado. And of course, just chaos ensues. We have a group of storm chasers who are like high tech, over the top, well financed storm chasers fighting against a small ragtag team, a group of storm chasers, which also stars Philip Seymour Hoffman in one of his earlier roles, if you could believe that. And yeah, this movie is really cool. I love the special effects in this movie. They used real, like, they kind of created real tornadoes in a sense on a soundstage, and they were putting these in the movie. They were tiny tornadoes, but that's how they filmed it to get some of those effects. Oh man, yeah, this is pure fun. And it took 30 years before they made part two, which is just as fun, but nothing beats the original. Especially nothing beats the charisma that Bill Paxton has. Now, there is a museum for this movie out in Oklahoma. They do have a Twister museum that has many of the props from this movie. So if you're interested in seeing some of the props and stuff like that, I would head out to Oklahoma to kind of check out the Twister Museum. There is an urban legend that's tied to this movie that there was a drive-in theater that was actually torn down when a Twister went through it while they were playing Twister. Not quite true. Kind of, in the sense that the theater was going to play Twister later that night before it got torn down. So there's kind of a thing in there. But yeah, there is urban legend tied to that. Um, After this movie, there was actually a 10% increase in meteorologists, if you can believe that. I think that's pretty fascinating, if you ask me. And of course, this led to a ride at Universal Studios called Twister Ride It Out that actually was opened in like 98 and actually lasted about till 2015, which is crazy. That's a long time. I wish I would have tried out this ride. I do remember seeing video footage and stuff like that of this ride, and it looks pretty fun. If you've checked it out, let me know. And for last but not least, my other fun fact is that the sound of the tornado is actually camels moan and slow down a lot. So that's a weird fun fact, and I put that in your brain just for some knowledge later on. So that brings me to last but not least, the final film that came out in 1996, also a Tom Cruise movie, but the first of many, many sequels, Mission Impossible, directed by Brian De Palma. Yes, the great Brian De Palma actually directed this movie. The guy who directed Scarface and Carrie. Yes, he directed the very first Mission Impossible. And this is a very simple story about Ethan Hunt and his, like, being accused of murdering the whole Impossible mission team. And we do have a nice little curve, little twist in the movie too. But yeah, it's a really fun, cool spy movie. This got people interested in spy movies again. Also, it's crazy thinking that this came out the same year Spyhard came out. So we had a spoof movie and a realistic spy movie come out the same month, which also I think hurt Spyhard even more, if you ask me. But yeah, this movie has gone on to have 7 sequels, if you can believe that, and all directed by some great directors. We had Brad Bird, J.J. Abrams, you had John Woo, you had, I think Chris McQuarrie is the one that's directing the last several movies. So yeah, this is a crazy franchise, and you know what? It's a really fun franchise. And this is all where it all began 30 years ago. However, there were some critics of this movie, and that's pretty much the cast of the original movie. A lot of them hated what this movie did. And they felt like the movie kind of ruined the actual series from the 60s. Especially the character, what they did with Jim Phelps' character. Yeah, the original cast just totally hated that part. So that's kind of a bummer when they don't get the accolades from the original cast. But yeah, that was all the movies that are turning 30 this month. Can you believe that? Yeah, May was a big month for movies, and we had some hits and we had a lot of flops, unfortunately. That also came out in May. Out of this list of movies, what was your favorite movie that came out in May of 1996? Are there new films on here that you're going to finally check out that you haven't seen before? Let me know in the comment section down below. And until next time, remember to hit the like, the subscribe, the notification bell. That way you're notified every time a new video is posted. And until next time, this is JD with the Figgy Pop Culture Channel.